Hey everyone, I need to get this off my chest. Maybe sharing my story will help me make sense of everything. It's about my wife Sophie, and how everything that seemed so perfect ended up, well, I'll get there. Let me start at the beginning. We met at a bookshop of all places, one of those quaint, cozy places with creaky wooden floors and a smell like old leather and fresh coffee. I was searching for a gift for my mom, and Sophie was in the same aisle, flipping through a glossy coffee table book about Paris. I couldn't help but notice her. She had this way about her, like she belonged in one of those black and white French films. Her dark hair was tied in a messy bun, and she was wearing this long beige trench coat that made her look effortlessly chic. She caught me staring and smiled. "Looking for something specific or just browsing?" she asked. I fumbled out some excuse about buying a gift, and before I knew it, we were talking. Sophie had a magnetic charm, the kind of presence that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She was funny, sharp, and had this uncanny ability to steer every conversation back to her travels, her tastes, her ambitions. I didn't mind. I was hooked. After that, we bumped into each other again, seemingly by chance, at a cafe near the bookshop. She joked that it must be fate, and who was I to argue? I asked her out properly that day, and we spent the evening laughing over overpriced tapas. The first 2 years were like something out of a romantic comedy. Sophie worked in marketing and always had creative ideas. She seemed ambitious and driven, which I found intoxicating. Meanwhile, I was hustling to make a name for myself as a journalist, stringing together freelance assignments while dreaming of a steady byline. We complemented each other. Sophie had an eye for aesthetics. Everything she touched turned elegant, whether it was planning a weekend trip or decorating her studio apartment. I was more the scrappy, roll-up-your-sleeves type, but I loved how she made life feel like an adventure. She'd surprise me with tickets to rooftop concerts or drag me to art galleries, where she'd explain why a single splash of paint on a canvas was worth millions. She also had a flair for drama. I remember one night when we got caught in a sudden downpour after dinner. Instead of rushing for cover, Sophie danced right there in the rain, her laughter echoing through the empty street. I thought I'd never met anyone so alive. But looking back, there were signs. Sophie had a habit of mentioning money. Not directly, she wasn't crass, but little comments would slip out. "That couple must be loaded to afford a place like that," she'd say while strolling through an upscale neighborhood. Or, "I can't imagine settling for a boring, modest life." At the time, I didn't think much of it. We were young. Who doesn't dream big? 2 years into dating, I proposed. It was a simple gesture, just us in that same bookshop where we met. Sophie cried and said yes, and for a while, I thought life couldn't get any better. We got married in a beautiful ceremony. Sophie planned it all herself, down to the smallest detail, a rustic vineyard, fairy lights strung in the trees, and a live jazz band. It was perfect, just like her. For the next 2 years, we poured ourselves into building a life together. I landed a steady job as a staff writer at a mid-sized magazine, which finally gave us some financial breathing room. Sophie switched to a new marketing role at a trendy firm downtown, one that came with better pay and plenty of perks. Our life felt like a whirlwind of passion and support. We'd stay up late talking about our dreams, debating politics, or binging TV shows on lazy Sundays. Sophie was my biggest cheerleader, always pushing me to pitch my stories to bigger outlets. And when she landed a big account at work, we celebrated like she'd won the lottery. But those little comments about money didn't go away. Sophie started talking more about the lives of her wealthier friends or the vacations her co-workers were taking. I shrugged it off as harmless chatter. We were happy, weren't we? I didn't realize it then, but those perfect years were laying the foundation for something far more complicated. Things were good. No, they were great. Sophie and I had built a life that, at least on the surface, looked solid. But then came the opportunity that would change everything. A contract for a series of war zone reports. It all started with a call from my editor. The magazine was launching an ambitious project covering global conflict zones, and they wanted me to be one of the lead correspondents. It was the kind of assignment every journalist dreams of, career-defining, adrenaline-pumping, and high stakes. The pay was substantial, more than I'd ever made in a single year, enough to cover our mortgage for 2 years, pay off some debts, and even put aside savings. But it came with a catch. I'm gonna be away from home and Sophie for a long time. When I brought it up to Sophie, I expected hesitation, maybe even resistance, but her reaction surprised me. We were sitting at the kitchen table when I told her. She was scrolling through her phone, sipping one of those green smoothies she loved. They want me to cover war zones, I said, watching her carefully. Her eyes lit up. Wait, really? That's huge. It is, I admitted, but it's dangerous. I'll be away a lot, and it's not just me. It'll affect us, our marriage. Sophie leaned forward, her elbows on the table. How much are they paying you? I hesitated, then told her the figure. Her eyes widened, and a slow smile spread across her face. Evan, that's amazing. Do you know what we could do with that kind of money? Her excitement was contagious, but it also made me pause. I'd been expecting questions about safety, concerns about being apart, maybe even a plea not to go. Instead, Sophie was already calculating how the payout could fund a summer in Europe, or that home renovation she'd been eyeing on Pinterest. You're okay with me being away so much? I asked. Sophie reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Of course I'll miss you, she said, her voice softening. But this is huge for your career. And think about what it could do for us. You've always wanted to be a correspondent, right? I'll hold down the fort here. We'll be fine. She was supportive, almost too supportive. Looking back, there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of excitement that wasn't entirely about my career or even the money. At the time, I brushed it off. She was just proud of me, wasn't she? The decision was made. I signed the contract. It felt like a leap into the unknown, but I convinced myself it was for the best. The first trip was 6 weeks long, with a 2-week break at home before the next assignment. As I prepared to leave, Sophie seemed eager to help. She bought me new gear, sturdy boots, a better laptop bag, even a first aid kit she insisted I pack. You have to promise me you'll use this if anything happens, she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. For those first few days, her support felt genuine. She'd send me off with long hugs, whispering, "You're my hero. Be safe." But the cracks started to show as the weeks turned into months. When I called home, Sophie's tone was warm but distracted. "Everything's great here," she'd say, but she rarely asked about my assignments. Conversations started to revolve more around what she was up to. Dinners with friends, new projects at work, weekend trips to the beach with colleagues. Once, during a video call, I noticed she was wearing a necklace I didn't recognize. "That's new," I said, pointing it out. "Oh, this?" She touched the pendant lightly. "It's just something I picked up. You like it?" I told her it was nice, but something about the way she avoided meeting my eyes stayed with me. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to these changes. To convey my mood, I will tell you a little bit about what my first trip was like. The first trip to the Middle East was like stepping into another world, a world where everything, even the air, felt heavy with tension. I landed in a sprawling desert city that was a mix of ancient ruins and modern chaos. My assignment was to report on the aftermath of a recent conflict, bombed-out neighborhoods, displaced families, and the soldiers trying to keep an uneasy peace. The first challenge was fear, not the kind that surges in a single moment, but the kind that settles into your bones. The streets were lined with checkpoints, and every car backfire sounded like an explosion. I kept reminding myself that I was here to do a job, but the constant tension was like a weight I couldn't shake. Then came the stories. Sitting in makeshift shelters, listening to people recount how they'd lost everything. It broke something in me. I'd ask questions, record answers, but at night, lying on the cot in my cramped room, I couldn't stop hearing their voices. A father who'd lost his son to a stray missile. A woman who hadn't seen her husband in years, unsure if he was dead or alive. The worst moment came during my 3rd week. I was shadowing a group of aid workers when we were caught in crossfire. I hit the ground, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We were fine, But the sound of those bullets was something I couldn't forget. By the end of the 6 weeks, I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. I'd done good work. My editor was thrilled with my stories. But I came back a different man. When I walked through the door, Sophie ran to hug me. Her perfume, something floral and expensive, was a stark contrast to the acrid smells of the war zone. She held me tightly, whispering how much she'd missed me. But I couldn't respond the way I wanted to. I couldn't explain how I felt, like I'd left part of myself back there in the dust and rubble. "Are you okay?" she asked later that evening as we sat on the couch. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just tired." At first, Sophie tried to cheer me up. She'd cook my favorite meals, suggest we take a weekend trip to unwind, even tease me about being too serious. But it didn't help. The truth was, I couldn't snap out of it. I'd seen too much. The laughter, the casual conversations, they all felt hollow now. I became quieter, more reserved. I'd spend hours alone in my office, reading or working, anything to avoid the suffocating small talk. Sophie noticed, of course. At first, her concern seemed genuine. She'd ask softly, "Are you okay?" or rub my back as I sat staring blankly at the TV. But her concern soon gave way to something sharper. "You've changed," she said one night as we sat in the kitchen, the sound of her wine glass clinking against the table breaking the silence. "You're so distant. I can't help but feel like you've stopped loving me." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "That's not true, Sophie. I'm just dealing with..." "With what?" she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You hardly talk to me anymore. You're always in your head. If you can't share what's going on, how am I supposed to believe that everything's okay?" "I'm trying," I replied, my voice strained. She didn't stop there. Her tone softened, but her words became more pointed. "And I have to ask, Evan, are you sure it's just the stress? I mean, you're spending so much time away. It would be natural if..." She let the sentence hang, unfinished, but the implication was clear. My heart raced. "Wait, you think that I've been unfaithful?" The idea was so absurd, so far from reality, that I struggled to find the right words. "Sophie, I would never..." "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said quickly, raising her hands in mock surrender. You've been so different since you got back, and I don't know why. It makes me wonder if something happened." "No, nothing happened," I said, louder than I intended. "The trip it was hard, okay? I saw things I can't even explain, that's all." The way she looked at me, calm, measured, made me feel like a suspect under interrogation. I stumbled through my explanation, trying to put my emotions into words, but it all came out jumbled. The more I spoke, the more I felt like I was failing to convince her. Finally, Sophie nodded, her expression softening. "Okay, Evan, I believe you." Her voice was steady, even reassuring, but there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't relief or understanding. It was the look of someone who had decided something but wasn't ready to share what it was. From that moment, an invisible barrier seemed to settle between us, one that no amount of explaining or apologizing could dismantle. Looking back, I think Sophie was afraid, not just of my changes, but of what they meant for her. She wasn't used to this quieter, more serious version of me. It unsettled her. She'd always been drawn to the Evan who was cheerful, kind, and carefree, the one who made jokes over dinner and saw the bright side of everything, the thoughtful, introspective person I was becoming. That seemed to scare her. But the strangest part was how quickly her concerns evaporated the moment my first paycheck from the trip came through. The tension in her voice disappeared, the sharp edges of her complaints dulled. It was as if she'd flipped a switch. She stopped criticizing me, stopped questioning my distance, and acted as though everything was fine. She even suggested we celebrate. "Let's do something special," she said with a smile, holding the statement from the bank as if it were a golden ticket. "We deserve it after everything you've been through." It was baffling, almost dizzying, how easily she seemed to forget her earlier frustrations. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this money would fix everything. But deep down, I knew better. Maybe her attitude toward our marriage had already begun to shift. My absence had given her a taste of independence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she liked it. Her phone calls with friends were longer, her weekends busier, and then there was that necklace, the one she still hadn't explained. Whatever the reason, the tension between us grew. Arguments started over nothing and escalated quickly. But I'll say it again, when I got my paycheck, it was like Sophie became a kind and loving wife again. The days blurred together in a haze of strained conversations and unspoken resentments. I thought the time at home would heal me, but instead, it felt like everything was unraveling. The worst part? I still loved her. Despite the fights, despite her sharp words, I wanted things to go back to the way they were. The second trip was just as grueling as the first, maybe even more so. Each day was a blur of chaos and exhaustion, dodging checkpoints, interviewing refugees, and filing reports from whatever makeshift office I could find. The weight of everything I'd witnessed pressed heavily on me, but I clung to the hope that one day I'd have time to decompress, to really talk things through with Sophie. Then, unexpectedly, circumstances aligned in my favor. Between the second and third assignments, I was granted a short break, a precious 4 days to come home. Officially, I needed to drop off flash drives of footage at the office. But once that was done, I'd have the rest of the time to spend at home. I didn't tell Sophie. I wanted it to be a surprise. In my mind, I pictured her face lighting up when I walked through the door, the two of us falling into each other's arms. It would be the perfect opportunity to reset, to remind her and myself of what we had together. On the plane ride home, I thought of everything I'd do. I'd bring her favorite pastries from the cafe she loved downtown, maybe flowers if I could find some decent ones on short notice. We'd spend the evening together, just the two of us without distractions. I imagined telling her stories from the trip, not the worst ones, but the lighter moments, the kind that might make her laugh. I wanted to see her smile, to feel close to her again. The flash drives were delivered to the office without a hitch, and by late afternoon I was pulling into our driveway, my heart pounding with anticipation. As I unlocked the front door, I was met with an unusual silence. No music playing, no sounds of Sophie's usual bustling about the house. I stepped inside, balancing the pastry box in one hand. "Sophie?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. There was no response. I set the box down on the kitchen counter, my gaze shifting to the living room. Frowning, I made my way to the staircase. As I climbed the stairs, I heard laughter. Light, flirtatious, unmistakably Sophie's. It was followed by a man's voice, low and unfamiliar. My pulse quickened as I reached the landing. The sound was coming from the den, a smaller room we rarely used. The door was partially open, and I pushed it wider. Sophie and a man I didn't recognize were standing near the sofa. She was holding a glass of wine, her body angled toward him in a way that felt intimate. He was tall, with dark, slightly messy hair, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks. His shirt was untucked, and the top of his trousers looked slightly unbuttoned, like he'd hastily tried to fix himself. At the sound of the door creaking, Sophie turned abruptly. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Evan, you're home!" she exclaimed, her voice unnaturally high. She quickly set the wine glass down and took a step toward me, her movements just a fraction too deliberate. The man glanced at me, then at Sophie, his expression a mix of surprise and discomfort. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, which only made it look messier. Hi, I said, my eyes darting between them. I wasn't expecting company. "This is Austin," Sophie said quickly, a bright, practiced smile on her face. "He's a friend from work. He stopped by to drop off some files and we were just catching up." Austin gave a small, awkward wave. "Nice to meet you, man. Sorry for, barging in like this." The words hung in the air, but my attention was on the subtle details. The faint flush on Sophie's cheeks, Austin's untucked shirt, his unbuttoned waistband. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Catching up, huh? In the den?" Sophie laughed, the sound forced. "Well, I was showing him the bookshelves. You know how proud I am of this room. And then we got talking, and time just flew by." Right, I said slowly, not bothering to hide the skepticism in my tone. She gestured toward the door, her smile unwavering. Austin was just leaving. Weren't you, Austin? Austin nodded quickly. Yeah, I should head out. Nice meeting you, Evan. He moved past me, practically bolting down the stairs. As soon as the door closed behind him, I turned to Sophie. What was that? What was what? She replied, her tone defensive. That, I said, gesturing to the room. The wine, the way he looked, I stopped myself. His pants were unbuttoned, Sophie. She rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, Evan. He spilled wine on himself. I told him to clean up in the bathroom. Is it so hard to believe that two colleagues can have a normal conversation without it being something scandalous? Her explanation came fast, too fast, as if she'd rehearsed it. Did he really need to clean up here? I asked. Sophie sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. I didn't realize I needed to report every little thing to you. You've been gone for months, Evan. I can't even have a friend over without you jumping to conclusions. I'm not jumping to conclusions, I said, though the truth was, I didn't know what to think. Her voice softened slightly, almost pleading. Evan, you're exhausted. You've been under so much stress. Let's not fight about this, okay? You're home now. Let's just enjoy the time we have together. Her words were reasonable, but the nagging doubts in my mind refused to quiet. Before I could press her further, Sophie's tone shifted again, sharp and cutting. You know what, Evan? This is exactly the problem. You come home after weeks of being gone and immediately start interrogating me. I'm the one who's been here alone, keeping everything together while you're off in God knows where. You don't trust me? Fine. Maybe I should stop trusting you. Her outburst caught me off guard, throwing me off balance. What are you talking about? I've never given you a reason to— Exactly, she interrupted, tears welling up in her eyes. You haven't given me anything. You're always gone, and when you're here, you're cold, distant. And now this? Accusing me of what? Cheating? With Austin? God, Evan, you're unbelievable. Her anger felt genuine, and for a moment I doubted myself. Was I being paranoid? Was this just a misunderstanding fueled by my own insecurities? I didn't accuse you, I said, my voice quieter now. You didn't have to, she shot back. It's written all over your face. I didn't know what to say. My gut told me something wasn't right, but Sophie had always been skilled at turning the tables, at making me feel like the unreasonable one. I need to think, I said finally, heading for the stairs. I'll stay at Mark's tonight. But we're talking about this when I get back from my trip. Sophie didn't try to stop me, and as I left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just walked out of a battle I didn't know how to fight. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. I drove to Mark's place with a storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. Mark was one of my oldest friends, the kind of guy you could count on when life hit you hard. He opened the door before I even knocked, probably having seen the mess of my face through the peephole. Whoa, you look like hell, Mark said, his brow furrowing. Yeah, feels like it too, I replied, stepping inside. Mark didn't press me immediately. He handed me a beer, waited until I'd taken a few sips, and then said, Okay, spill it. What's going on? I told him everything, coming home to Sophie and Austin, the awkward scene in the den, the way Sophie had turned the conversation into an attack. Mark listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. Man, that's rough, he said when I finally finished. And this Austin guy, you sure it was all just work like she said? I shook my head. I don't know. It didn't feel right, Mark. But she's so convincing. She always has been. And now I'm sitting here, wondering if I'm paranoid or if I just caught her in a lie she didn't have time to cover up. Mark leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Listen, you've been through a lot. Between the trips, the war zones, everything. But that doesn't mean your gut's wrong. If something doesn't add up, it doesn't add up. Simple as that. For the next few days, Mark did his best to distract me. We hit up an old dive bar we used to love, played endless rounds of pool, and even went hiking in a nearby state park. Mark kept the conversation light most of the time, But when the subject of Sophie came up, he didn't hold back. "Here's the thing," he said over beers one night. "You've got this huge trip ahead of you, Ukraine, right? You can't let this eat at you while you're over there. That's dangerous. You need to focus." "I know," I admitted, "but I can't stop thinking about her, about us. It feels like we're falling apart, and I don't know how to stop it." Mark clapped me on the shoulder. "You'll figure it out. Maybe some time apart will help clear the air. And hey, if you need to talk while you're out there, you know I'm just a call away." Meanwhile, Sophie and I didn't speak. Not once. I thought about texting her, trying to smooth things over before I left, but every time I picked up my phone, I hesitated. She didn't reach out either, and that silence was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Part of me hoped that this distance would give us both time to cool off. Maybe when I came back, we could have an honest conversation. No yelling, no accusations. Maybe we could start to fix things. The morning I left for Ukraine was gray and cold. Mark dropped me off at the airport, giving me one last pep talk as we stood by the curb. "Stay safe, all right? And don't let this Sophie thing mess with your head out there," he said. I nodded, gripping my bag tightly. "Thanks, Mark, for everything." As I sat in the terminal waiting for my flight, I scrolled through my phone, half hoping for a text from Sophie. Nothing. I thought about sending one myself, something simple. "I'm leaving. Be safe." But the words felt hollow. Instead, I boarded the plane with a heavy heart, bracing myself for what lay ahead. I had no idea that the trip to Ukraine would change more than just my career. It would change everything. Ukraine was unlike anything I'd experienced before. The conflict was brutal and unrelenting, the days filled with the constant hum of uncertainty. I embedded with aid workers and soldiers, documenting their stories, and the weight of their realities was crushing. Blackouts were frequent, leaving entire cities cloaked in darkness. Communication was spotty at best. Sometimes the internet worked, sometimes it didn't, and cell service was a gamble. Each day brought its own set of challenges, from navigating ruined infrastructure to staying alert for air raid sirens. The physical toll was one thing, the long hours, the freezing cold, but the psychological stress was worse. Every face I interviewed, every destroyed home I photographed, added another layer of heaviness I couldn't shake. Despite it all, I poured myself into the work. It was the only way to keep my mind off what I'd left behind. Sophie's face haunted me at night when I lay on a cot, the distant rumble of artillery lulling me to sleep. One morning, during a rare window of stable internet, my phone buzzed with a notification from our joint bank account. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another automated reminder about fees or balances, but something made me check. Sophie had withdrawn $5,000. It wasn't the first time she'd used the account for a large purchase, but what caught my attention was the frequency. A quick scroll revealed multiple withdrawals over the past 2 weeks. $3,000 here, $4,500 there, totaling close to $20,000. My stomach tightened. What could she possibly be spending that kind of money on? I tried calling her immediately, but the call wouldn't connect. I sent a text. "Hey, just saw some transactions from the joint account. Everything okay?" No response. I sent another. "Sophie, can you please call me when you get this? I'm worried." Still nothing. As the hours stretched into a day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I contacted my sister Lucy back in the States. "Hey Lucy, can you check on Sophie for me? She's not answering my texts or calls, and I've noticed some weird activity on the bank account." Lucy was concerned but not alarmed. "Sure, I'll swing by the house tomorrow. Maybe she's just busy. You know how she is." But when Lucy called me the next day, her voice was tinged with unease. "She wasn't home," Lucy said. "I left a note, but I haven't heard back. Have you?" "No," I replied, my chest tightening further. I reached out to Mark, asking if he could stop by. He sent me a message later. "Mark. Stopped by the house. Lights were off. Didn't look like anyone was there. You want me to call her?" "Yes, please," I replied. Mark tried, but Sophie didn't pick up for him either. Desperate for answers, I contacted Sophie's parents. They were polite but dismissive, saying they hadn't heard from her recently. "I'm sure she's fine," her mother assured me. "Sophie's always been independent. She probably just needs space." I wasn't convinced. When Lucy tried to reach Sophie again, this time through text, she finally got a response. "Sophie, everything's fine, just busy with work. Tell Evan not to worry." But that was it. No call, no explanation for the withdrawals, no reassurance beyond those few vague words. Feeling helpless, I turned to my fellow journalists in the U.S. A couple of them offered to dig around, see if they could find anything. One of them, Jim, a seasoned investigative reporter, called me after a day of searching. "Evan, there's nothing obvious," Jim said. "No hospital visits, no major purchases that stand out publicly, but something feels off. Do you want me to keep looking?" "Yes," I said, my voice strained. "Please." As the days dragged on, I threw myself even harder into my work, trying to drown out the gnawing fear that something was unraveling back home. But the silence from Sophie and the mounting confusion from my family made it impossible to focus fully. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured her standing in that den with Austin, her too bright smile, her quick, practiced excuses. Deep down, I knew I'd been avoiding the truth for too long. I was in a cramped, dimly lit shelter in eastern Ukraine when I received Jim's call. The reception was terrible, cutting in and out, but his tone was urgent enough to send a chill down my spine. "Evan," he said, his voice crackling, "you need to hear this." I stepped outside into the cold, my heart pounding as Jim began to relay what he and a few other journalist friends had uncovered during their investigation. First, they confirmed what I had feared. Austin wasn't Sophie's colleague. He wasn't even remotely connected to her professional world. He was a random guy she had met through mutual friends at a party months ago. According to their research, Sophie had been seeing him regularly, often while I was away on assignment. "She's been careful," Jim explained. "Mostly meeting him at places outside your neighborhood, hotels, bars across town. But we've got photos, timestamps, and even some social media posts from people who saw them together." My grip tightened on the phone. "So, this wasn't just a one-off thing," I said bitterly. "No," Jim confirmed. "It's been going on for a while, and here's the kicker. She's not just dating him, she's betting on him, like he's her way out." The money Sophie had been withdrawing wasn't for emergencies or major expenses. It was being funneled into a separate account under her name. Some of it had gone toward gifts for Austin, designer clothes, a luxury watch, and even a down payment on a car. But the withdrawals were only part of the story. Jim's team found records showing Sophie was quietly selling off assets, including some furniture and jewelry we had acquired together. "And there's more," Jim said. "She started the process of selling the house, not directly. She's using some legal loophole to move it into her name exclusively. She's probably planning to flip it for cash before you can stop her." I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. "How? That's our house. My name's on the deed." "She's working with someone shady, an agent willing to bend the rules. She hasn't filed anything official yet, but she's close." And then came the final blow. Sophie was preparing for divorce. She hadn't filed yet, but had already hired a lawyer and was gathering documentation to build a case against me. "She's painting a picture," Jim said. "She's framing your absence as abandonment and spinning stories about emotional neglect. She's also putting together a claim for a significant share of your assets, saying she supported you emotionally while you were off making a name for yourself." "That's ridiculous," I snapped, pacing the icy ground. "She's the one who—" "I know," Jim interrupted. "We all know. But she's laying the groundwork, Evan. She's good at this." The week in Ukraine stretched out like a slow-motion nightmare. The stories I covered, families torn apart, entire communities erased, should have consumed all my attention. But Sophie's betrayal, her calculated maneuvers, and now her public campaign against me gnawed at the edges of my mind, an inescapable shadow. I first heard about her blog from Jim, who called me one evening after filing his own report from New York. "She's going public, Evan," he said, his tone grim. "She started a blog. It's about relationships and marriage. She's painting you as the villain." "What do you mean?" I asked, my grip tightening on the satellite phone. Jim sighed. "She's claiming you're emotionally abusive, that you've got unchecked PTSD from your trips, and that you refuse to seek help. She's even implying you're aggressive, though she's being careful not to outright accuse you of violence, yet." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. That's insane. She's making me out to be a monster. "She knows what she's doing," Jim said. "It's calculated. She's playing the long game to justify everything she's been doing. Taking money, preparing for divorce. She's building a narrative that'll make it hard for you to fight her in court." As a marketer, Sophie knew how to spin a story. Her blog posts were polished, persuasive, and targeted at the emotionally vulnerable. She used vague anecdotes. A partner who shuts you out. A marriage where one person does all the emotional labor. To paint a picture that wasn't explicitly about me but was clearly designed to suggest it. She shared videos, her voice soft and full of faux vulnerability, saying things like, "Sometimes we don't realize we're in a toxic relationship until we step back. It's hard to admit, but it's the first step toward healing." Her followers grew rapidly. She was a natural on camera, and people ate up her story. Comments flooded her posts with messages of support. "You're so brave." "I went through the same thing. Thank you for speaking up." Watching it all unfold through screenshots and forwarded links, I felt sick. But my colleagues weren't about to let her control the narrative. Jim and the others launched a counter-campaign, leveraging their platforms and investigative skills to expose the truth. One journalist wrote a detailed exposé outlining Sophie's financial maneuvers, her affair with Austin, and her efforts to paint herself as a victim. The piece was backed by documents, screenshots, and quotes from mutual friends who were willing to speak out. Another colleague created a short video highlighting my work as a journalist, showcasing the stories I'd covered and the lives I'd helped amplify. The message was clear. I was no abuser. I was someone who had dedicated his life to telling difficult truths. The public response was swift and divided. On Sophie's side, her followers rallied around her, defending her as a brave woman standing up to her oppressive husband. On my side, people began to question her narrative, especially as more evidence of her financial scheming came to light. The pressure on both sides was immense. Sophie doubled down, using her marketing expertise to maintain her victim persona. She posted tearful videos, claiming she was being attacked by a powerful group of journalists trying to silence her. Meanwhile, I felt increasingly isolated. I was thousands of miles away, in a country ravaged by war, unable to defend myself in person. My colleagues were doing everything they could, but the weight of the situation bore down on me. Nights in Ukraine became unbearable. I lay awake, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with Sophie, searching for the moment it all started to go wrong. Was it my absence, my work, or had she always been this person, and I had just refused to see it? I wanted to protect my reputation, my property, everything I'd worked so hard to build, but the fight felt overwhelming, and there were moments when I thought about giving up, letting Sophie take what she wanted just to be free of the chaos. But then I'd think about the lies she was telling, the resources she was draining, the way she was manipulating not just me, but everyone around her. I couldn't let her win. At the same time, the strain was tearing me apart. I felt like I was fighting two wars, one in Ukraine, against the horrors of conflict, and one at home, against a woman I once thought I'd spend my life with. The only thing that kept me going was the support of my colleagues. They reminded me of who I was, someone who sought the truth, no matter how painful. "You're a fighter, Evan," Jim said during one late-night call. "You've faced worse than this. Don't let her take you down." I clung to those words as the days crept by, counting down the hours until I could leave Ukraine and face Sophie's lies head-on. When I returned to the U.S., the fallout of my marriage had spilled far beyond the walls of our house. It wasn't national news or even statewide, but in our town it was impossible to avoid. Everywhere I went, there were whispers. The barista at the coffee shop gave me a long, knowing look as she handed me my latte. The older couple sitting in the corner paused their conversation when I walked by. And then there were the bloggers, local voices who had latched onto the story and turned it into endless speculation. Is Sophie Traynor a victim or a manipulator? One post read, accompanied by a heavily filtered photo of her from her blog. Another post claimed to have insider info about the supposed abuse she endured, complete with quotes pulled from her vague but emotionally charged videos. Passers-by would occasionally stop me in the street. Most were polite, some even supportive. "Hey, I read about what's going on," a man said one afternoon outside the grocery store. "Hang in there. People are starting to see through her story." But not everyone was sympathetic. A woman approached me while I was picking up dry cleaning, her tone sharp. "If what your wife says is true, you should be ashamed of yourself." I didn't bother responding. How could I explain the mess to a stranger in a parking lot? Sophie's blog had exploded in popularity. Every few days she posted new content, shifting effortlessly between vague accusations about our marriage and heartfelt advice for others in supposed toxic relationships. "It's hard to admit when someone you love is hurting you," she said in one video, her eyes glistening with carefully staged tears. "But it's the first step toward healing. To anyone out there going through this, just know you're not alone." The comments were a mix of blind support and growing skepticism. "You're so strong, Sophie. Keep fighting," one follower wrote. "I don't know. This doesn't add up," another chimed in. Sophie ignored the dissenters and doubled down, turning her narrative into a brand. She even offered to appear on local podcasts and YouTube channels, where she'd recount her journey with practiced vulnerability. While Sophie played the victim online, I was busy working with Sarah and my colleagues to untangle the mess she'd left behind. We gathered everything: financial records showing her withdrawals, emails revealing her affair, and testimony from friends who had seen her and Austin together. "She's laying the groundwork for a brutal divorce," Sarah warned during one meeting. "But we're building a case that will blow her narrative apart." My colleagues weren't just helping with evidence, they were also countering Sophie's campaign in their own subtle way. A few local reporters started publishing pieces that questioned her story, highlighting inconsistencies and pointing to her financial scheming. "She's playing a dangerous game," one article concluded, "and the town is watching closely." When we finally went to court, the atmosphere was electric. Sophie arrived flanked by her legal team, her polished demeanor carefully crafted to exude confidence and poise. I came with Sarah and a stack of evidence compiled by my colleagues: financial records, photos of Sophie and Austin, transcripts of her blog posts, and witness statements from friends and neighbors. The trial was brutal. Sophie's lawyers painted me as an absentee husband with unchecked PTSD, a man who had abandoned his wife to chase a dangerous career. They brought in social media posts, selectively edited to show Sophie's struggles while I was away. But Sarah fought back with precision and ruthlessness. She presented the financial records showing Sophie's unauthorized withdrawals, her attempts to transfer ownership of the house, and her extravagant spending on Austin. "She claims to be a victim," Sarah said during her closing argument. "But the evidence tells a different story. Sophie Traynor is no victim. She's a manipulative opportunist who saw an opening to take advantage of her husband's trust and dedication to his work. And she took it." Outside the courtroom, the tide of public opinion began to turn decisively against Sophie. Articles and opinion pieces highlighted the contradictions in her narrative, questioning her motives and the timing of her accusations. "She's not fighting for justice, she's fighting for a payday," one columnist wrote. Even some of Sophie's staunchest supporters began to distance themselves. Comments on her blog became less sympathetic, with many questioning her sincerity. "Your story doesn't add up," one person wrote. "Stop playing the victim. It's disgusting," another said. The courtroom was tense as the case drew to a close. The judge, a stern woman in her late 50s, had maintained a measured demeanor throughout the proceedings, but it was clear that even she was struggling with the weight of the decision. "This is one of the most contentious and complex divorce cases I've seen," she said at the start of the final session. "Both parties have presented substantial arguments, and the court must carefully weigh the evidence." Sophie's lawyers pressed their narrative hard, emphasizing her blog, her claims of emotional neglect, and my prolonged absences. Mrs. Traynor deserves her fair share, they argued, painting her as the long-suffering spouse who had sacrificed everything for our marriage. But Sarah countered with precision, presenting the evidence my journalist colleagues had unearthed. Detailed timelines of Sophie's affair with Austin, records of her secret withdrawals, and her attempts to sell the house without my knowledge were laid bare. This is not a case of a neglected wife, Sarah argued. This is a calculated attempt to exploit a marriage for personal gain. The evidence speaks for itself. For days, the judge deliberated. Each time we returned to court, she seemed more burdened, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the mountains of documents and testimonies. The town watched closely, with local bloggers and reporters providing near-daily updates. In the end, the journalistic investigation proved pivotal. The detailed evidence and public scrutiny left little room for Sophie's narrative to hold. When the judge finally delivered her decision, her tone was deliberate and firm. "This has been a challenging case," she said. "Mr. Traynor has presented compelling evidence of financial misconduct and infidelity, while Mrs. Traynor's claims of emotional distress, though significant, lack substantial corroboration." Her ruling was a compromise. I was awarded half of our property and 60% of our joint finances. Sophie retained the remaining assets, but the court mandated a freeze on her attempts to sell the house. It wasn't the total victory I'd hoped for, but it was enough. Sophie's initial reaction was defiance. She posted a teary video claiming the court's decision was unjust and that she'd been silenced by the system. For a brief moment, her most loyal followers rallied around her, offering words of support. But the cracks in her story had already spread too far. Articles questioning her integrity had circulated widely, and people in town began to view her with suspicion. At work, things fell apart quickly. Her firm, wary of the bad press surrounding her, started phasing her out of high-profile projects. Within weeks, she was quietly let go. As her professional life unraveled, her personal life followed. Austin, sensing the collapse of Sophie's carefully curated world, disappeared. One day he was there, and the next, he wasn't. No calls, no texts, no explanations. Sophie was left with the remnants of her social media following and a dwindling circle of supporters. Her blog posts grew sporadic, filled with vague updates and increasingly desperate attempts to regain sympathy. For me, the victory was bittersweet. I'd won, but the battle had taken its toll on my reputation, my peace of mind, and my trust in people. Still, I felt a sense of closure knowing that Sophie's schemes had been exposed and that she hadn't been able to take everything from me. I found myself replaying the past over and over, trying to make sense of Sophie's actions. Was Austin really worth it? The man she'd risked everything for had vanished the moment things got tough. Had she genuinely believed he was her golden ticket to a better life, or had it been about more than him? Maybe Sophie's choices had nothing to do with Austin. Maybe it was about control, her desire for something bigger, shinier, more glamorous than the life we'd built together. Or maybe she was just as broken as the marriage she'd tried to exploit. The hardest part was realizing that I might never have a satisfying answer. One thing was clear. I'd been blind to the warning signs. Her obsession with appearances, her comments about money, her ability to manipulate emotions, all things I'd ignored because I wanted to believe in us. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake again. A few weeks after the court decision, I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Mallory, and she came highly recommended by a friend. She was calm, insightful, and didn't shy away from calling me out when I avoided hard truths. We didn't just talk about Sophie. We also delved into the things I'd bottled up from my time in conflict zones, the fear, the guilt, the nights spent wondering if I'd make it home. "You've been carrying a lot, Evan," Dr. Mallory said during one session. "It's no wonder you're exhausted, but you don't have to carry it alone." For the first time in years, I felt like I was learning how to let go. It was during one of my therapy breaks at a small cafe I liked that I met Claire. She was a journalist, like me, and we started talking when I noticed her editing photos of a protest on her laptop. "You've got an eye for framing," I said, gesturing to her screen. She smiled. "Occupational hazard. You a photographer?" What started as small talk turned into a long conversation over coffee. Claire was sharp, funny, and shared my love for storytelling. There was a warmth to her that felt like a balm after everything I'd been through. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I started seeing each other more often. At first, I was cautious, afraid of repeating the mistakes I'd made with Sophie. But Claire was different, open, honest, and genuinely kind. She knew about my past and didn't shy away from it. "We've all got scars," she said once, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "But they don't have to define us." Her words stuck with me. Months turned into a year, and slowly I found myself again. Therapy, my work, and Claire's steady presence helped me rebuild from the rubble Sophie had left behind. I no longer felt like the man weighed down by betrayal and chaos. The lessons I'd learned from my experiences, both in war zones and in my personal life, taught me resilience. I started to see the world differently, not as a place defined by its struggles, but as one full of stories waiting to be told. Sophie, meanwhile, faded from my life like a bad dream. Word reached me through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another part of the country. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation had largely failed. The local blogging community that once adored her had turned cold, and professional opportunities dried up. But Sophie hadn't changed. She continued to blame me for her failures, spinning her own version of events to anyone who would listen. I ignored it. Whatever she said, it didn't matter anymore. As for me, I felt ready to take on the world again, this time with a sharper sense of who I was and what I stood for. My editors offered me a new assignment in a conflict zone, and I accepted without hesitation. Standing at the airport, Claire hugged me tightly. "Stay safe," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I will," I promised, feeling a quiet confidence I hadn't known in years. As the plane ascended, I looked out at the horizon. The future stretched out before me like a blank page. Sophie's shadow no longer loomed over my life. I was free, stronger than before, and ready to write the next chapter, on my terms. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.